Hi, I'm Greg.
And I'm Leanne.
Welcome to the Empowered Poly Podcast, where we give you the tools to help you feel more empowered
in your polyamorous and consensually non-monogamous relationships
by sharing what we've learned as relationship coaches and as individuals.
Empowered Poly is LGBTQ2IA+, alternative lifestyle, and kink-friendly.
Thank you for joining us,
and enjoy the show. Hi, and welcome to episode 39 of the Empowered Poly Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking all about boundaries. So, Greg, why don't you do what you do best and start us out with a definition?
I love definitions, don't I?
I know.
Yeah. So in doing my research for this, I came across a definition that I really enjoyed from one of my personal heroes, Brene Brown. She says, what's okay with you and what's not okay with you. I love the simplicity of that. That's what a boundary is. It's what's okay and what's not okay with you. Further to that, we define boundaries as what we're comfortable with and how we wish to be treated by other people. So those are the definitions that I found the most comfortable. Do you have anything that you want to add to that?
No, I think those are really great, simple, straight to the point. When I'm working with clients, we often talk about how do we articulate boundaries. And so I articulate them as I will only be in a relationship with someone who, or I will not be in a relationship with someone who.
Right. Yep. And that actually leads me to the next thing, which is about boundaries, and the definition of a boundary is oftentimes boundaries are either rigid or porous, right? So a rigid boundary would be unyielding and absolute. So this is always this way. I think that's good for certain things because there are certain things that do need to be rigid in order for us to feel safe, right? So as an example, I will not have sex with someone who is having unprotected sex with multiple partners, right? That could be a rigid boundary. That's not going to change no matter who you're with, no matter what the situation is, right? That's not going to change. Another example is maybe you don't date people who smoke or do drugs, right? I won't date somebody who does drugs, period. Right? Those are rigid boundaries. On the other end, porous boundaries. So porous boundaries are defined as weak and easily breached. So a porous boundary could be, I'll do this thing even though I don't really want to. Or I'll let this thing slide even though I don't really agree with it. As an example, I'd prefer not to have sex on the first date, but since you're telling me that I'm being unreasonable, I'll do it.
Right? Oh, that gives me the ick.
I know it does. But that's an example of a porous boundary, right? So if your boundary is that I won't have sex on a first date, then, be a bit more rigid with that. Ideally for everyday life, our boundaries should be somewhere between rigid and porous. Because if they're too rigid all the time, then we could be actually distancing ourselves from things and experiences and people. And if they're too porous, then we're distancing ourselves from ourselves.
Right. Sort of self-abandoning, right?
Yeah, totally. Right. We'll get into the types of boundaries in a minute, but if you're constantly at the beck and call of someone, even at risk to yourself, right? You never have time for yourself because you're always available to other people, then that's not being kind to who you are, right? And that can become challenging for the relationship that you have with yourself.
So a couple things came up for me while you were talking. One is that, boundaries can only be negotiated with ourselves. They're not up for debate. It's not that you bring your boundaries to your partner and go, how does that sound? These are personal and they are about you. They are not anyone else's concern to comment on or to judge or to say that's not fair or that's not right. A boundary is a boundary, and it's important enough to you that it has become a boundary. And usually that's through some sort of experience. Like you've had an experience where, something's happened and you felt really uncomfortable and hated it, didn't want that ever to happen again. And so you create a boundary around that. And like you said, we do need to assess things kind of as we go. in real life, over time, they can be fluid and they can change.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for people like me, a people pleaser in recovery, uh the self-abandoning piece was huge as part of my behavior for the first, I would say, 4 decades of my life.
And by self-abandonment, you mean what?
I mean, I had porous boundaries. I didn't even have boundaries. I didn't feel entitled to boundaries.
Mm.
And so that's probably some learned behavior too. I came from a family that really wasn't aware of how to have healthy boundaries. Um, not to say anything negative about my family really, but they did struggle with that, and it hurt everyone, I think, in our family group over time. I've seen it in multiple situations, in multiple ways. Um, and then when you go out into the world and you're navigating other relationships, even at work,
Mhm.
you don't know how to have a voice, how to advocate for yourself, how to stay strong in a boundary and say no to something. So you say yes to everything, you overtax yourself, and you're beyond your capacity, and you don't
Totally.
do a good job at anything. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's
totally.
in relationships at work, and in your personal world too. Like if you're saying yes to everybody else, you said being at the beck and call of someone else, and you're not really thinking about your own needs, you can go decades without recognizing what I actually want to do with my own alone time, right?
Do you even know what alone time is?
Right.
Like, are you one of the people in the world that can't be alone
Ugh,
because you don't know what that feels like because that's way too uncomfortable for you?
used to be me.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you actually started talking about this, and I know you touch on this, so I'll let you do it. But the steep learning curve, right? There is that steep learning curve that you're referring to. You want to say more about that?
Yeah. So that it's super uncomfortable when you start using boundaries for the first time with someone that has been used to you not having boundaries, and also just personally. So there's kind of those two, there's the external pressure to not have boundaries from someone who's benefited from you not having them.
Mhm.
And then there's the internal pressure or guilt or feeling selfish,
Or
you
shame,
know, shame. Hmm.
right?
Yeah, that comes up.
I shouldn't need this. I shouldn't need this. So why am I asking for it? Why is it important to me? I'm being unreasonable. I'm being ridiculous.
Mhm. It's so hard when you're not used to saying no. And how to say no, how to
Yeah,
articulate a boundary is important too. You might write
right.
it down as I will not be in a relationship with someone who, right? But
Yep.
then in the communication of it, that's maybe not the best way to talk about a
Yeah.
boundary.
Right, right.
You might want to gentle them into it and say, I've been feeling kind of overtaxed this last week and I need some alone time,
And see how they respond.
rather than saying, yeah, and see how they respond. Yeah, exactly. Rather than saying, I have a boundary around alone time.
Yeah, I mean, but I think in our work, when we're trying to tell people, or when we're coaching people and helping them establish get an understanding of their boundaries, establish them, and then advocate for them, it can
Mhm.
feel unwieldy. It can feel awkward at first to start to
Totally.
advocate for those boundaries, right? Because you're not sure, right? You're not sure how the person that you're doing it with is going to react to that.
Hmm.
You've been acquiescing this whole time, and now all of a sudden it's like, what's the big deal, man? Like, hadn't been a problem before, but why is it a problem now? Well, I don't really care to share that information with you, right? Well, why are you being a jerk? Why are you being an asshole?
Can be very challenging for them. And hearing that
Exactly.
response can be very challenging. Yeah.
Exactly. It can make you feel like you're doing something wrong, like I said, you're being unreasonable, or you're being a dick, or you're being, whatever, difficult to deal with. But the reality is that you probably are being difficult to deal with for the other person. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. They're gonna react the way they're gonna react. That's not your
Mhm.
responsibility. That's not something that you can control. All you can do is try to advocate for your boundaries in the kindest and most respectful way possible.
And using those I statements, I think, is the best way to approach boundary communication.
100%. Yep.
I've noticed about me, I have even identifying to someone, I've noticed that I have not been, standing up for what I need in my
Mhm.
in my life. And so I'm
Yep.
really working on that. And I would appreciate your support as I figure this out. Kind of giving
Yeah.
them the heads up. I'm doing boundary work,
Yeah.
so there's going to be times when I am going to say no to things that I've said yes to before. And that might sound weird or feel weird to you, but I want you to understand where it's coming from. And it's coming from
Right.
a self-care place. Yeah.
Absolutely. And further to that, understand that you don't owe anyone an explanation for your boundaries.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I mean, we often talk about being a compassionate partner and having
Yep.
those communication pieces in place so that it's smoother. The
Totally.
transition from no boundaries or very few or a lot of porous boundaries to, now being more rigid, now being more um, proactive,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
Totally. I agree with you 100%, but that's not always the case. That's not always going to need to be the case.
No.
Right. So let's say you have somebody that you have a fairly casual relationship with, and you decide one day that you don't want to do a certain thing that you've been doing.
Mhm.
Right. And you might say, and by casual, I mean like super casual, like I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but the
Someone that
reality
you
is,
work with.
yeah, somebody that you work with, right? And let's say they've been telling, off-color jokes to you, and you've just kind of let them slide. And then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, I find these jokes offensive.
Yeah.
So then the next time they tell you an off-color joke, you come out with, I'm not open to hearing those kinds of jokes from you anymore. Can you please stop doing that?
Yeah.
And they you don't and they go like, what's wrong? What's the matter? You don't owe that person an explanation,
Right.
right? That's what I mean. And if you're in a partnership with somebody and you feel like you do want to give them that explanation, that's great. That's fine. But just understand that you don't owe it to them. It shouldn't be an expectation of yourself to be able to to have to do that every time.
Mhm. I feel very comfortable sort of talking through my boundaries with a new partner and saying, just so you know, this is where I'm at. These things may change over time, but this is where I'm at right now. And, looking for alignment there because
Mm-hmm.
if those boundaries are truly boundaries and not preferences,
Right.
which is what you were talking about earlier about, getting really porous with your boundaries, they might actually not be boundaries. They might be preferences. Like I would prefer not to date someone with children, but oh, I met this person and they have children, and oh well, that doesn't matter now. It's not really
Yeah,
a
that's
boundary
true.
then, it's a preference.
That's true.
So when you're starting to look for alignment, you're vetting new partners, it might be a good thing to talk about and just say, I've been doing some boundary work and I'd love to share that with you if you're open to hearing that so that we can see if we're on the same page.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's also a great way to try and suss out if the other person has boundaries or if they are aware of them and
Right.
their ability to be able to communicate them.
Good point. I find it troubling when someone says I don't have any boundaries because that worries me. We talk or have talked previously about, if someone says no, I want that.
Yeah.
You thank me for my no's. I love that. You say thank you for looking out for yourself. And it gives me such grace and permission and encouragement because I am not used to having boundaries. And when someone says no, you can trust their yeses, right?
Yep.
And when that happens, it feels like there's more, understanding of who that person is and what they need from you and what they don't want in their world. Even if, even if it's something that you don't necessarily agree with or need for yourself, you can decide, can I do this? Right? Can I accommodate that boundary? If not, maybe it's a fundamental misalignment and it's not the person for you to be in a relationship with. Or you have to reframe the relationship. Maybe it's not going to be a specific type of relationship. So those are some things to think about. Have I
Yeah,
jumped
those are all.
ahead? I might have.
Well, that's all right. Nobody but you and I knows that we have an outline. So
We have an outline.
we have an outline. No, now everybody knows we have an outline. Shit. I fucked that up, didn't I? I do want to add though to that speaking of boundaries and advocating for them, and this idea that your ability to be able to tell me no means that I can trust your yeses. That trust is paramount in relating. It needs to be there, and it's cultivated over time through consistency. Yeah. And so
Mhm.
boundaries are a part of that. I want to
Mhm.
know what you don't want to do. I want to know what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with.
For
That's
sure.
important. That's important to me to know that. And then on the flip side of that too, when you're with somebody who is doing that work as well, what you'll find is that they'll be more open and receptive to it because they don't take it personally, because it isn't about me. When you say no to me, it's not about me. It's about you. It's about your comfort level, not mine.
Mm,
Yeah. I
true.
mean, I thank you. Yeah. So I like, hey, I want to go ride bikes today. Do you want to go with me? No. Well, and I know that you don't want to go with me always because you don't ride bikes. That's not the point. The point is that when you say no to me, that means that when you do say yes to me, I know you're fucking in it. Like you're there, you're doing it with me because you're able to say no if you really feel that way.
Right.
And so I can trust you, which then cultivates deeper connection, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, and which is ultimately what boundaries are supposed to do, is cultivate deeper connections because you get to know that person better. And that's why it's important to have a really clear understanding of your boundaries, which leads me to the next section in our outline. So, and that's
Go
the
for it.
types of boundaries, right? So why don't we just take these one by one? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the first type of boundary is time. This is
Mhm.
how we choose to spend our time. A really good example of that would be I will not answer any messages while I'm on a date with someone else.
Mhm.
So that's important to understand, and we're going to get into what boundaries are not in a minute, but I do want to take a moment here to recognize the difference in that, in the way that's phrased versus the way people would commonly phrase it. So I'm saying I will not answer any messages while I'm on a date with someone. Common people, sorry, commonly people would phrase that as don't text me while I'm out on a date.
Yeah. And in that case, what we're doing is we're telling someone else what to do.
Right. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that because that's a section that we're going to discuss. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is that these examples of boundaries are written specifically this way for a reason, because we are not attempting to control other people. We are simply advocating for what we want and how we choose to spend our time. In this case, I choose to spend my time with someone and be fully present with them. So you can text me until you're blue in the face, but I have set the expectation that I am not going to respond to those texts until after my date is over. And I will let you know when that is.
And there's, kind of softer ways
Oh,
to
sure.
communicate that.
Sure.
It could be uh I have intentional time with my partners during which I'm not in contact with my other partners. And that applies to you too, right? That gives them a little bit of like, oh, I get the benefit of that. Not just the, I can't text you, but they get the benefit of your intentional time, your focus. So it might be kinder to, or more compassionate to communicate it in that way, where it's clear that it's something that matters to you. It still sets up the same expectation, but it gives them the idea of like how it will help your relationship with them as well.
Mhm.
What do
Yeah.
you think of that?
Yeah, totally, totally. I,
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that the examples that I came up with are very direct and very short examples for the sake of the economy of time.
Okay.
And so we can get into, like, there are a multitude of different ways depending upon who you're talking to, right? You might advocate for a boundary one way with somebody and do a completely different way with somebody else, like we used earlier with a work example, right? So
Mhm.
these are very, very economic ways with words. There's an
Okay.
economy of words being used here specifically because we don't have a whole lot of time, right? But absolutely, I mean, you totally want to give whatever sense of compassion, respect, kindness that you want to give when you're advocating for your boundaries, but just be mindful of of using I statements like you mentioned earlier. I will, I won't, I do, I don't, right? I prefer to spend, I like spending intentional time with my partners. So I will not answer any messages while I'm on a date with someone. And that includes you.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
just feels so much like warmer. Like I'm included. I get the benefit of that too, right?
totally. Totally. However, on the flip side of that, though, let's talk about something that would be more self-care oriented.
Okay.
Okay. So let's
Hmm.
use an example of self-care, self-care. I mean, as an example, shit,
I have one.
going off the, going, yeah, go for it.
uh I have Sundays as my day to myself.
Okay. What does that mean to me?
That means it's alone time. I will not be going on a date, making plans, going out. I'll be unavailable. I might be offline. I might, you know, go hiking by myself,
Okay.
those sorts of things. So if
Great.
Sunday is my self-care day, um, that's a boundary that I've created in my world to protect my peace and get me ready for the next week ahead. And I need that
See,
time to do
here,
laundry or whatever. Yeah.
here's what's interesting though, and this is something that I think is really interesting. You feel the need to explain all of that.
No, no, I'm explaining it for the viewers and the listeners.
Oh, oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So
And
is
if
that something that
someone's
you,
curious about it, I can certainly explain it, but it's not, like I said earlier, it's not up for debate if
right?
it's a boundary.
But would you
It's,
would you find yourself normally explaining that to someone? Or would you just
mm,
say, just so you know, I take Sundays to myself as a self-care day,
I don't
and
think
that
most people
means,
would press.
but let's say they didn't press. Would you feel the need to automatically explain what that means?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Not at this point in my life.
There was a time though where you might have,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
that's what I'm getting at.
About 8 years ago.
That's what I'm getting at is that that's where that people pleaser, that's where that those learned behaviors, that steep learning curve that you referred to earlier comes into play. You
For
feel like you
sure.
have to over explain yourself and why that's
Justify,
important to
justify.
you. Justify. Yeah, perfect. Justify. Yeah, exactly. You have to justify the reason that this boundary exists for you. When in fact, all you really need to do is say, hey, I really dig you and I want to spend time with you, but Sundays are off limits because I chill with myself on Sundays.
Yeah.
Boom. Done. Right.
Yep. And
By
it
the
can
way, we're
even be,
trying.
I'm not available. You don't even have to say what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It could
I'm
be a
not available on
situation
Sundays.
where, you have other partners that you have a set day with, and that's your day. But
Right.
perhaps if you're practicing parallel poly with a limited information agreement, see our podcast on relationship agreements. If that's the case, you might not want to say, Sunday I'm going to spend with my partner. That's not you. And instead,
Very
you might
true.
just say, I'm not available on Sunday. Let's look at another day.
Yeah,
Mhm.
totally. Do you want to do the next one or you want me to?
Sure, I'll do it. So physical boundaries, our body, our belongings, and our environment. So an example would be, I'm not comfortable hugging someone I don't know. And I mean, when we're coming up against boundaries that we haven't recognized yet, that's also another steep learning curve where it's like, oh, I've been doing this for years and I hate it. I don't like hugging people I don't know. I feel very uncomfortable. And I walk away feeling kind of icky in my body and unsure of myself and maybe a little angry.
But when I was raised, I was always told it was polite to hug your grandpa. It was the
Even
polite
if you
thing to
didn't know
do.
him
Is
very well or
even
spend
if you
much
didn't
time with
know him
him.
very well, even if you, it was polite to hug your grandfather's friends or your dad's friends, or if they were to go,
Yeah.
oh, you're so cute, give me a hug, right?
Mm,
And you don't refuse that, and so that gets ingrained into your programming, and then all of a
yeah.
sudden you become a hugger, even though you don't really like hugging.
Yeah. And that extends, I think, for me as a young girl, there was a lot of situations like that where it was, I would say, probably mildly inappropriate, like come sit on my lap, and it's my father's friend and I don't really know them and I'm 12 and I feel like I have to, you know, because I'm being
Yeah,
told by an adult what to do. And that was what I was taught was appropriate,
right.
you know.
Yeah, totally.
We were, I
Another,
mean, to be fair to my family, my parents did, encourage us to question things, but there was also sort of social norms
norms.
that were like that were expected. Yeah. I don't even think it was articulated ever. It was just assumed.
Yeah. So another example might be with belongings. For instance, I have a rather large record collection and I have a boundary. I won't
Mm.
loan my records out to anyone. You want to listen to a record? Come over to my place and we'll listen to it together.
Well, and
So
that even
that's a boundary.
extends to like when we travel and there's a dog sitter here,
Yep. Yep.
right? This is
Yeah.
off
Even though
limits.
there's somebody in our home, my records are off limits, right?
Mhm.
So that's a belongings thing. An environment thing could also be, you know what? I don't go to loud clubs.
Well, not always me. I put my hand up, but it was me
Yes,
for a
yeah.
number of years.
Aren't you going tonight
I'm
to a
going out tonight, yes.
yeah,
But I
to
will
a
wear
loud
earplugs. So,
right. Right. So that's not necessary, but that's a real here, live
hmm.
example happening in the moment, right? So that would be an example of a flexible boundary.
It was a
But
boundary. Now it's a preference. And now it's also something I can manage because I couldn't
right.
manage it before
But it
when
was a
I was
boundary before.
freshly brain injured.
I won't go to clubs that have, loud music, right? That was a boundary. You couldn't do it physically, right? We're talking
Correct.
about physical boundaries, environmental. Now it's like, yeah, I can go to this thing as long as I have A, B, and C.
And I take breaks, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, I might not even stay that long. There's
Right.
all these kinds of contingency plans in place to manage the environment. Right.
I think personally, though, that's still not a preference. I think that's still a boundary because the boundary becomes different, right? Before it was very rigid. Before it was very, I won't go to these environments, period.
Mhm,
Now it's I will go to these environments under these conditions
mhm,
as long as I have X, Y, and Z. That's still a boundary, but it's a more flexible boundary.
mhm,
A
mhm. Right.
preference would be I don't like going to those environments,
But I'll go
but I'll go,
if you
or
want
I
to.
won't go. Yeah, my preference would be not to go, but if that's where you want to go and hang out, sure, I'll give it a shot. That could be a preference, right? You don't have a strong feeling one way or the other about it. But if you do have a strong feeling about it, in this case you do, because it's physically damaging and hurtful to you,
Mhm.
Now the boundary is that you have the conditions, right? And as long as those conditions are met, you're able to go and enjoy yourself,
Yes.
right?
For
Makes
the
sense?
most part, and sometimes it's not true. You get there and it's really too loud. It's like, no, tapping
Yeah,
out,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And then that becomes the boundary is I can't be in this environment. It's too loud. So I'm
Mhm.
going to dip out.
And that's
You have
another
fun.
reason. Yeah, it's another reason to share these boundaries with people so that
Mhm.
they understand why this is a challenge for you and that, maybe that's not the place to take you on a date. Or if it is, meet the conditions. Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. So should we move on to the next one?
for sure.
All right. So the next one is emotional. So emotional boundaries protect our right to our feelings without criticism from others. Because we all have a right to our feelings. Nobody can tell us that what we're feeling is wrong. But people do criticize us, right? As mentioned earlier with the whole, I don't, typically have sex on the first date, but you're telling me it's unreasonable, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. You're
Hmm.
telling me that my safety, my feeling of safety is unreasonable. So that's a boundary. That's an example of an emotional boundary. I don't, and another example is, and this is actually, sometimes this is where people can get confused that this is actually an emotional boundary, but I don't want to share that information with you. So an
Hmm.
example of that would be you ask me how I'm feeling, and
Okay,
my
how are you
response
feeling?
is, yeah, yeah, um, I'm not really comfortable sharing that information right now.
Right. And so, as the receiver of that information, there can be a lot that comes up, right?
Yeah, totally. You could assume
Managing
that I'm
that is very important.
right,
Don't put that out there on that person as if they're wrong for having that
or
boundary.
or press them for more information. Because oftentimes when we using that as an example, when it comes to emotional boundaries, right, we then go into a state of manipulation where we want to try to get more information out of them, not because we give a shit about what they're going through. At least in my experience, this was me. I didn't care about what my partners were going through. I cared about how it affected me. Am I the problem? Am I the
Right.
reason that you don't want to share this with me? Are you mad at me?
Taking
And
it
that's my
personally.
that's my BPD and my codependent tendencies, right? I want to, like you, people pleaser. I want everybody to be happy with me, not because I care about their feelings, but because I care about feeling safe. And that's
Hmm.
that whole abandonment trauma bit. And so when it comes to our emotional feelings, it was very difficult for me to say to you that I'm not comfortable talking about that right now. Even that little caveat at the end, right now,
Hmm.
could still be somewhat problematic because it implies that there will be a time when I will be comfortable, right? So I think that
Yeah.
the beauty of it is that when you find a partner or partners or people in your life and you literally work on training your people
And yourself.
through consistent advocacy of your boundaries in a kind and respectful way, what ends up happening is they then go, oh, okay, wait a minute, right? This isn't really about me. This is about them. So yeah, I'm going to give them what they've asked for in this case, which is I'm going to honor that boundary and not press it. I'm not going to push it. And I'm going to trust that they're going to come to me when or if they decide that they're ready. If they decide maybe this isn't a big deal and they can process it themselves, that's great. Even if it is about me, even if I did do something stupid or dumb or whatever, it, it, it it's still not about me in that moment. It's about them and the impact that my actions or words or the situation had on them. Yeah.
Hmm. It can really become a cycle of triggering each other emotionally, where it's, you know, someone speaks their boundary, the other person takes it personally. They have a reaction. They're in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. They're either trying to like fight you on the boundary, or they walk away in a huff, or they
Mhm.
stand there and look at you like, what the hell? or they start to do the fawning thing like, are you okay? Is everything okay? Can I do anything? What do you need? And da, 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 to try and elicit more information. And and then that can feel to the person who set the boundary as combative or invasive or problematic. Now I have to manage your reaction. I don't get to have my space to process. We went through that.
Yeah, we did. Totally. I used to be horrible at that. I used to be horrible at pressing you, even
Me too.
unconsciously. I wasn't doing it on purpose. That was just a
Default.
natural sort of reactive result of when somebody was advocating for a boundary saying, I don't want to talk about it right now. I'd be like, well, can you at least just tell me if it's about me or not? Or, what did I do wrong this time? Or,
And so
what do you need?
there is something there that can be on offer if you have the capacity for it. If you're setting your boundary and you can say, I'm not really feeling comfortable about talking with you about that. And it's not about you. I just want processing time. That little bit, I know you said don't explain, but I think sometimes that little bit of explanation can de-escalate any kind of reaction that they might be starting.
For sure. Totally. And again, that's that compassionate partner piece that we talk about, right? And you mentioned earlier is that if that's something that you're inclined to do and that's something that you want to do, because that's the way you want to communicate in a compassionate, kind, loving, and respectful way, that's great. Go for it. But just a reminder that that is not necessary in order to advocate for a boundary. That's all I'm saying about that. So, and that actually brings up another point too. Oftentimes people can manipulate this particular boundary, these emotional boundaries, and use them as a way to shut down or shut out. And that's different. If somebody's constantly saying, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it, and it's everything that they don't want to talk about, or if that's their natural reactive state, something happens, something upsetting happens, they're like, you know what, it's not worth it. I want to fuck it. I don't care. I don't want to talk about it. That's not the same thing. That's avoidance.
Stonewalling.
That's stonewalling. That's avoidance. That's a defensive tactic that's used as a way to try to for self-protection. Ultimately, both of these things are about self-protection, but they are different ways of getting to that point. And the boundary work is about saying, I'm not comfortable, or I don't want to share that information with you right now, or I don't want to share that information with you at all because I don't feel that it's relevant to you. Right. Yeah. But I can tell you that it's not about you. I'm just dealing with something else. Right. That's a very different statement than fuck it, I don't want to talk about it. Right. That's shutting down. That's pushing people out. And that leads to disconnection and distrust and fractured foundations and relationships. And that's not what we're talking about here.
I think all of these can be used in a healthy way and in an unhealthy way.
Yeah, for sure.
In a helpful way and in an unhelpful way, right?
Yeah.
When we're setting boundaries, sometimes, the pendulum swings pretty hard to that really rigid side. And we do need to kind of be strong about our boundaries. And we might not be very compassionate in our communication of them. And so it can come across as abrasive or rude or combative, right? So what we do want to work towards as we work through the getting used to having boundaries is that nice happy medium where we're still understanding of our partner and what they're going through potentially in this conversation, and strong in our own boundary. We don't have to acquiesce. We don't have to over explain. We might offer something so that they don't feel it's about them, or to kind of mitigate any reaction.
All excellent.
So let's move on to the sexual one, what we're comfortable with in our sex life. So an example would be, I will use barriers with all new partners for at least 6 months. When we are talking about sexual boundaries, they can be about particular activities that we want to engage in or don't want to engage in. And pressuring your partner to do those things is not tool. Just saying, consent is
Yeah,
everything.
we're actually going to get into a little bit of that later in terms of the idea that you're trying to pressure somebody into doing something or continually not honoring agreements or their boundaries, right?
Let's get into it now.
You want, do we still have another type of boundary to talk about
That's
though?
okay.
So is it? Bounce around?
Sure.
Okay.
Bounce. We're
Yeah.
bouncing.
So we're bouncing. So yeah. So if somebody does continue to pressure you, let's say to do a certain sex act that you're not comfortable doing, and you've advocated for that, and you've told them repeatedly, time and time again, that you don't want to do that, and they keep pushing and pressuring you to try to do it, well, the boundary then becomes an ultimatum, right? If you keep asking me to do this thing, then I'm not going to have sex with you.
We won't be
Period.
sexual partners.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We won't be sexual partners. I'm going to stop having sex with you
Or
because
we
I
might not
can't.
be partners in any capacity.
Right. Exactly. So a boundary can become an ultimatum. I think the biggest difference between boundaries and ultimatums, and you and I haven't always seen eye to eye on this, so I'm going to be interested to hear your response. But I think the biggest difference between a boundary and an ultimatum is intention. Intention meaning that if I'm advocating for a boundary, my intention is to try to cultivate connection with you and tell you, hey, I'm still down for this relationship. I'm still down to be doing these things with you, but this is just not something I'm comfortable with. An ultimatum then becomes, my intention is to let you know that if this behavior doesn't stop, I am no longer down to be in a relationship with you. And that's the difference, because there's a lot of talk in the world about, well, isn't it just ultimately an ultimatum? Well, no. I mean, if I'm saying I don't want to do butt stuff with you, that's not an ultimatum. That's just me telling you that I don't like doing butt stuff. But if you continually want to probe my butt and push that button, then it will become an ultimatum. You like my example?
Yeah.
Then it will become an ultimatum, right?
Yeah.
And I will be saying, hey, look, you touch my butt one more time and we're done.
I don't think we disagree on this.
No?
No. All I've ever said is that if a boundary isn't ultimately going to be an ultimatum, if it keeps getting crossed, then it's not really a boundary, it's a preference.
No, it's a porous
Boundaries
boundary.
become ultimatums when they are crossed and you're uncomfortable. I will not tolerate being in a relationship with someone who wants to do butt stuff with me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my boundary and it equals my ultimatum if you keep asking.
Right. Yeah. But I think in the world of relationships and discussions and stuff, I have seen people say that there is no difference between a boundary and an ultimatum. And I disagree with that statement. I think there is a difference, and I think it comes down to intention.
Right. You're
Uh,
just, I think it's a timing thing. Your intention piece is right now it's a boundary. And then right now, after these circumstances have happened, it becomes an ultimatum. It's the same thing as what I'm saying. What I'm saying is boundaries are ultimatums ultimately, because if they are crossed, they become the ultimatum. And it's
Yeah.
okay to have ultimatums. I think one of the problems I see in a lot of relationships is that people are so afraid of having ultimatums. They're so afraid of saying, I won't be in this relationship if this continues. And there's nothing wrong with ultimatums. We need them. We should have them. We should know where our limits are
But
and advocate for them.
should we be leading with them though?
Leading?
Leading with them. Yeah. Like for instance, if the first time out of the box somebody does something and you don't know that it's a boundary for you until they do it, and then instead of just advocating for that boundary, you leap directly to ultimatum mode, which is don't ever do that to me again or else I'm leaving you.
Mm-hmm.
That's problematic.
It could be very reasonable,
It
depending on
could,
what the thing is.
yeah, I suppose you're right. Yeah, it could be, but yeah, I think if you're always in that default space, no matter what the thing is, right? No matter, whether it's don't use my toothbrush, or um, you know, don't pick up my records,
Mhm.
or it's something much worse, much more abusive, much more, I don't want to get into it, but you know what I mean?
Heinous.
Like,
Yeah.
heinous, right? I think if you're using the ultimate, hey, don't ever touch my fucking toothbrush again, or else we're over.
Mhm.
That's a bit.
Well,
That's a
and
bit.
yeah,
That's an ultimatum that's not necessary, I think, and that doesn't foster connection. That fosters disconnection,
correct.
right? And so that's what I'm saying is that sure, there are times when ultimatums are necessary. The difference, the fundamental line, is the intention behind it.
Yeah, but if you're in a relationship with a germaphobe, that could very well be an ultimatum.
That's true. That's true. I was trying to
So
find a very, very
innocuous one. Yeah.
innocuous example. But yeah, you could make any example into, I think, an extreme example. Given, like, I was going to say, well, if you touch my paper clips again, well, if you were with somebody who has OCD, that could be problematic, right? So I get
Yeah.
what you're saying. I guess what I'm saying is and I don't know that I feel like I'm being heard in this, and I think that's why I keep harping on it, is because it's important for me to acknowledge for my own relating that I don't want to go from 0 to 100. 100 being ultimatum, don't do this or we're done, with every single thing that I have as a boundary.
Yeah, I don't think that's very common that people do that with every single thing. That seems like it would be unusual. But it might be that part of that pendulum swing where they're like not used to having boundaries, or they've been through something really awful.
Mm-hmm.
And they say, like when we first met, one of my boundaries was I won't be in a relationship with someone who raises their voice to me. We
Mm-hmm.
have since crossed that barrier, and it's no longer a boundary, only because I trust you in the intention of working things out. We've worked things out enough that I recognize that raising your voice to me isn't an assault. But it felt like one when we first got together, because I had just been through a marriage where I had been yelled at for no reason, and it felt like an assault. And so I was sensitive to that.
Right.
And at the beginning of our relationship, you were quite mindful of not raising your voice to me. And when you did apologize because you recognized it was a boundary for me. And in that apology and us working it out and all of those things, I started to lose the need for the boundary. But having said that, I still don't love it. But I do see it as part of a process that is a bigger, broader, you know, process that we go through, that sometimes that happens. And I'm not scared of it, but I was.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a relationship with somebody who is traumatized or scared of things, or really trying to like find their boundaries and being very vigilant about them, it can be hard. And you might not want to be in a relationship with someone like that, and that's cool.
Mm.
Um, it can feel like a lot of threat. Like you keep threatening to break up with me every time I do something you don't like.
Right. The cry
Yeah.
wolf syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Does
let's move
that
on to the next. Yeah.
does that sound
I think,
reasonable?
yeah. Yeah, for sure. Totally. Yeah. I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if we're not, I'm also okay with that.
Right.
So,
Yes.
all right. So the next boundary category, the final boundary category, is intellectual. So this includes your privacy, your autonomy, your beliefs, values, politics, finances, and culture. So an example of that would be, I will only discuss my finances with my nesting partner
Mhm.
or nesting partners, depending upon your preference for KTP or whatever. So that's an example, right? Another example could be, I won't talk politics with my dad because we don't see eye to eye, right?
Mhm.
I love him to death, but every time we talk about politics, it doesn't go well. So my boundary now is that I don't talk about politics with my dad,
Mhm.
right? And so
And
that's
it
an
and it
intel.
protects the peace of the relationship in some ways,
Exactly, yeah.
which can be a good thing.
And always, really, in this case, because that's really the only bone of contention that I have with my relationship, or with my father's worldview
Mm.
is his political stance. And he's entitled to it. Don't get me wrong. Like, I get it. I try not to judge him for it, but maybe I do. But the point is that it's not that I'm not trying to tell him stop thinking that way, or you're an idiot for believing this. What I'm telling him is I don't want to talk about this with you.
Hmm. And that leads us right into the next point, right?
Right, which
Which
is what
is,
boundaries aren't.
yeah, a boundary is not a rule. A rule is when you're telling someone else what to do.
Right.
And some people argue that it's just semantics, but again, I think it comes down to intention, like you were saying
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah.
The intention here is to not tell someone else what to do, but to protect myself, to lead myself into a place where I feel comfortable and safe.
The defining difference between a rule and a boundary is a rule is meant to limit or control somebody else's behaviors.
Yeah. And a boundary is about you and what you will do under certain circumstances.
And with rules also come the implication that there are punishments if the rule isn't followed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's going to be punitive results if you don't do what I've told you to do.
Mm-hmm. There can be punitive results from a boundary too, but what you're saying is punishment is I am the person who metes out the punishment to you rather than this is a natural consequence of a boundary being crossed.
Yes, that's
Mm-hmm.
right. If you
Mm-hmm.
don't do what I say, this is what's going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a rule. An example would be you can't date that person because I don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
You can't take your partner to that restaurant because that's my favorite restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Those are examples of attempts to control. Those are not boundaries.
So a boundary might be I won't spend time with your other partner because they're not my cup of tea, right?
Yeah. Using the restaurants as an example, right? Boundaries can lead to requests,
Yeah. Yeah. You can always
right?
ask.
I'm not, you could say something like, I'm not comfortable with you taking your partner to that restaurant because that restaurant's been our restaurant. So is it reasonable to request that you not take them there?
And then we can make a relationship agreement.
Right. And then we can talk about it. Right.
See
Yes,
our
it is reasonable.
podcast on relationship agreements.
Yeah. I like how we both dip in and do this. So this is your inner voice talking. So I think that's important. Is it that the example that we have here is I'm not comfortable being around you when you drink too much. Can you
Mm-hmm.
please refrain from getting drunk when we're together?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm not doing there is I'm not saying to that person, don't drink. I'm not saying
Correct.
don't get drunk. Right? I'm not saying you can't get drunk or you can't drink or you need to stop drinking. Right? All of which are control statements, limiting statements, attempts to put
Rules.
rules.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that I'm not comfortable being around you, me, when you drink too much.
Mm-hmm.
So can you not drink so much when we're together and not get drunk?
You then have a choice to make as the person who hears that. Can I do that? Can I accommodate that request? And if not, I need to be honest about that and not make an agreement about that.
That leads me to something else that I just realized what just came up for me is one of the reasons that people are hesitant to do boundaries work is because they are afraid of the perception that the other person is going to have of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was actually just having this conversation yesterday with someone about being the villain in someone's story.
Oof.
So let's use this as an example, this drinking too much as an example. So let's say I say to a partner, hey, yeah, I'm not comfortable when you drink too much. Can you please refrain from getting drunk when we're together? What they hear, what they perceive is that I'm calling them a drunk. And then they're like, well, you fuck you, I'm going to do it anyway. You're trying to
Mm-hmm.
control me. You're a buzzkill. You're not having any fun, da 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 da, yada yada. Yeah. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
then then 5 years from now, when they're referring back to this relationship that ended because you had a boundary in place around their drinking, well, you become the villain in that. They thought I was a drunk and they didn't like me, and they were, they needed to loosen up a little bit and have a little bit more fun, and they were party poopers. They accused me of being an alcoholic, or
Yeah.
they told me that they were afraid that I was going to get abusive with them. There's a whole host of things that they could extrapolate from that one statement if they really, really wanted to. And the reality is that none of that is your responsibility. As long as you're not saying those things, that's not your responsibility. You're not saying, hey, you're an asshole when you're drunk.
Mhm.
You're saying, I'm just not comfortable being around you when you drink too much.
Mhm. And that
That's it.
could be for a host of reasons.
Sure. Yeah.
Could be
We've had
from your own
absolutely
history with alcohol. It could be from, family or friends that you've been involved with who were out of control, drunks who you put you at risk. Loads of reasons. And
for
you don't
sure.
have to
And
explain them.
no, right. But the point is that that one of the biggest fears about advocating for boundaries and expressing them is that you become the asshole in somebody else's story.
And that's just not in your control.
And that's just not something that you can do anything about.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
matter how kind and compassionate, sometimes that's going to happen,
Mhm.
especially with those people that, like you mentioned earlier, are used to getting away with the things that you're trying to set boundaries around,
Mhm.
right? You're going to become the asshole in their story, at least for a little while, or maybe not. Maybe they're going to be, oh yeah, thank you so much, right? But it's highly, I think it's highly unlikely in a lot of situations where that's going to happen. So I think there is going to be an adjustment period
Well,
for
and
people.
certainly giving them some opportunity and time to process the new boundary setting that you're doing
Mhm.
might be very useful.
Yeah. And also, like,
Recognizing those reactions will come up. Those
yeah,
feelings of judgment will come up. I mean, I I was vegetarian for 16 years of my life, and during those years people felt judged because they were eating a burger in front of me, and I had never felt judgmental about them. It was about me and what I wanted to put in my body. You do you. I'm fine over here, but they sat there and felt bad and got defensive, and it was a bizarre
thought that you
experience.
were better than them.
Yeah, yeah. Thought that I
What
was
are you
better
more?
than them.
What are you better than me because you don't eat meat?
Mhm.
I mean, there's a saying in the NLP world, neuro linguistic programming world, that says that perception is projection, and that is
Mhm.
100% true. Our perception of things is just a projection of our own lens. It's the way we see things, and it has often has nothing to do with who we actually are. It's just the way
Mhm.
the person. It's just the person's worldview and experiences is influencing their perception of who we are, and so
Mhm.
therefore we become that person to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And someone
So
else has said, someone else's opinion is none of my
none of my
business.
business. That's right. That's right. So, and I think that that's really important. And maybe that's a good place to leave it, is this idea that boundary work is hard. It's not easy. It's not easy for you. It's not easy for the people that you love and care about that aren't used to it from you. So I would encourage you, as you mentioned earlier, for the people that you feel it's necessary to do this with, to let them know that you're actively doing this boundary work
Mhm.
and that it might feel unwieldy and awkward. But the intention is not to disconnect. The intention is actually to foster deeper connections, because now I'm starting to understand myself better, understand what my wants and my needs are. So I'm not going to be hugging everybody on the planet anymore. And sometimes that might mean you. Sometimes I might not want to hug you.
Mhm.
And I'm going to say, I don't really want to hug you right now. And that's not about you, that's about me. And so
Yeah.
there is a way that you can approach this with the people that you feel are worthy of that conversation. And I
Mhm.
think you need to have that conversation so it doesn't become so, abrasive sounding.
Mhm.
Yeah. But for the rest of the world, fuck them.
Right on. And just to wrap up with that too, if you want help with your boundaries, discovering what they are, how to communicate them, working with your partner, reach out to us as your coaches. We are certified relationship and sexuality coaches here to help. And also, if you like our content, please give us a follow or subscribe, depending on what platform you are on. Send us a comment so that we get your feedback. And yeah, encourage us or tell us what we missed. We love that. We want to hear it all.
Yeah, support is always welcome. Share it with your friends, your family, anybody else that you can think of that might resonate with the messages that we're sending out. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening and / watching, and we appreciate everybody's support and yeah, Dunzo.
And remember,
choose love
and keep it kind.
We'd love to hear your comments, questions, or topic suggestions, and don't forget to subscribe.
And you're invited to join our Facebook group, Empowered Poly Relationship Support and Advice.
You can reach out to us on our websites at gregmillion.com
and at leannemillion.com,
or follow us on Instagram at @thegregmillion
and at Leanne Million.